Real privilege to welcome you to our first Kōrero this evening. If you're anything like me, you started work on Monday, and so this is your first week back, so I appreciate those that are able to make it. And thank you for those in New Zealand. Kia ora, Mum. Good morning. Welcome here this evening. I really wanted to start this year really solid for Voices and Voyages, and it is a platform to connect us as Māori and Pacific Islanders here in the UK and Europe, and it's based on 3 pillars. So we have profile, where we spotlight the journeys and achievements of those in our community who are doing amazing things in their fields. We have promote, where it's about elevating the events and the stories and the contents of our people with really diverse experiences. And the final one is connect. So it is around building a professional network to sort of foster that collaboration and growth. So this year it's all about connection. It's all about how do we sort of establish and grow a professional network. And so we're starting off on the 9th of January 2025 with a really focused discussion on reframing leadership. And it's going to be a short discussion, and really it is around to sort of spark reflection and sort of inspire some action. Just a bit of a shout out for the other 2 sessions we're going to have. We're going to have one on the 23rd of January with Tania Beasley around networking through relationship building. Tania was the head of Kia here in the UK, and she's returned home to Wellington, so we'll be having a conversation with her. And then on the 6th of Feb, we will have a panel discussion with 3 people. Catherine, the original Nepo baby, will be one of them. Kai Vai Andrews will be the other one. And Les Potama will be the other one. That'll likely be an in-person event where we will talk about these dual identities and how we really navigate these global spaces. So this first one is around reframing leadership through emotional and cultural intelligence. And I really wanted people to walk away at the end of the night really reflecting on the type of leadership that they have, gain some deeper understanding of what emotional EQ and cultural CQ intelligence is, and consider how they apply it in their professional roles. So I'm going to hand over to Rawinia after all that to sort of introduce herself before we crack on. Kia ora, Rawinia.
Kia ora, thank you, Claire. Kia ora, ladies. Ko Rawinia aho. I whakapapa up north to Ngāi Takoto as well as to Tainui. My background is primarily in retail leadership and training and developing teams across the experiential marketing industry. For me, leadership was something that I never wanted to do. And it was something that I was naturally pushed into because of the natural leadership skills that I have being Māori. And that's something that took some time for me to really understand and to really discover and then strengthen and build on, because for so long I didn't actually think I was a leader. And so I'm really excited to be co-leading this with Claire, just to support you all to just really reframe what leadership might mean to you, especially in a professional context, and just really getting you to really utilize the strengths that we all have within our own different cultural identity and how we can really amplify and leverage that within the spaces that we're in. So yeah, that's a little brief background.
So I think it's in terms of the schedule, there's only a small group of us, so I think it can be really an open dialogue. Rawinia and I are just going to have a kōrero really around what is leadership, around what is emotional intelligence, what is cultural intelligence, how do we practically apply this into what we're doing. what I'd really like to see is, whilst we're having this conversation, if you have any experiences, if you have any questions, please jump in and ask. It's really important to sort of share these insights and really help each other understand our own definitions. So jumping straight in, Rawinia, I think you and I have, even the first time we met each other, we talked about this and talked about leadership. But in that, in some global spaces, in that real, I would say, like Western view, leadership is often thought of as quite linear, like around hierarchies and titles and positions. But for Māori and Pasifika, maybe it can look really different. So, what does leadership mean to you?
I really love this question. For me, it's about connection first and foremost. So being able to, one, connect with yourself and really understand yourself, but then also connect with the people around you. And so be that the team that you're leading, be that with perhaps any stakeholders that you have within a professional context. It's really about being able to connect with people first and foremost, because that's how we build trust. And then if we're looking at it from the space of, again, like a professional context, that is also how we receive the outcomes that we need within business. And so for me, it always starts with connection first and foremost, versus kind of that linear kind of aspect of leadership being this something that's like quite directive, quite authoritative. For me, it's about actually what does it look like in relationship with people. That's my definition of leadership. And I believe that that's how you get the best out of people as well.
What do you think? So, when we think of whanaungatanga and manaakitanga as terms, how do you think they relate to leadership? Or, yeah.
Mm, mm. Well, when I think about manaakitanga specifically, it's like generosity. So when you're a leader, my belief is that we're being generous with the strengths and the gifts that we have, but within that as well, it's like, what are we doing to be able to support everyone around us, to be able to amplify their strengths and their gifts? So that there, for me, it's about that understanding respect is actually acknowledging that I don't have all the answers, but actually, if we can operate together and we can come together with all our own unique strengths and really just look at it as like a collective, there's like a kete of knowledge and wisdom within everyone within the business context, like, and just being respectful of that. Like, can we respect one another from that manaakitanga perspective? And then also that also comes back to that whanaungatanga again connection. And so it's more like the way that I do really look at it is almost like a kete. It's like the flax kind of like being woven together, and like how are we kind of weaving these different strengths of each and every person within the business, within the organization. And as a leader, what we're here to do is to kind of support the facilitation of that. That's how I view it anyway.
Yeah, and do you think that is demonstrated? Like in the global spaces we work in over here, because sometimes it can be quite individualistic, and I think manaakitanga and whanaungatanga really challenges that a little bit. But actually, it probably adds to that sort of Western view.
I mean, what I think I love about being Maori, and it'll be quite different. I'd be really curious to hear how Jacinta sees this based on, like, you know, her own personal culture, is that um the way that as Indigenous people we see things from this collective space, like you can achieve so much more together as a team. Like really the outcomes that you experience within the workspace, within, like, if you're looking at it from like a profit perspective, which, you know, is how a lot of businesses operate. The way that we're going to get there is by working together and working kind of essentially like, are we in the same waka? Are we all going in the same direction? And so I'm not sure if I'm actually answering your question, but this is actually kind of like what's kind of coming through at the moment is that, you know, like, yes, we can operate individualistically, but like what's the outcome that we're getting from that? And that's quite ego based. Again, in my opinion, it's like, okay, if we're operating here in this silo, if we're operating here in this silo, that we're not going to get the types of results that are possible if we're actually speaking to one another, if we're in communication with one another, and if we're actually coming together to be able to understand each person's different perspective, and then understanding how we can come to some type of compromise or collaboration around where we're going together and ensuring that we're working towards the same outcome.
Yeah, and I do think that we innately have those qualities when we do manaakitanga and whanaungatanga. And I think for me, when I was reflecting on our conversation, is I didn't realize that that's what they were. So I work with a range of clients, so I'm not at one place for too long. So it's really important that I develop relationships quite quickly so that we can get this piece of work done, so that it can be at a really high quality and value. And so manaakitanga around making sure people in that team, because they're usually cross-functional, right? It's usually someone from finance, someone from marketing, someone from HR, that we have to do the strategic piece of work, feel value in that team, feel value and empowered and uplifted in that space. And because I think I naturally work quite collaboratively, and so manaakitanga is very important to me. And I think particularly in lockdown, when I had to do lots of Zoom calls with quite a broad range of colleagues, so from Singapore, Estonia, Australia, America, you really had to have a bit of manaaki, but really have that real cultural understanding as well. So I think we innately do it anyway, and then, but I don't think that's what we would say it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. In a professional context, like, it's considered emotional intelligence, right? But it's just something innate in who we are as Māori and Pasifika people. It's how we grow up. It's the values that like run through our blood. Like, you know, it's within us, it's within our DNA. And like you say, it's something that you innately do, which is a leadership skill. And it's like that ability to be able to find that connecting thread, right, between all these different cultures. Okay, so what's the thread that kind of brings us together, and how can we kind of utilize that to be able to support what it is that we're working towards together, that collaborative approach that you're speaking about.
Yeah, which are really quite sort of the indications of the leadership, right? Is getting the best out of your team, but also making sure you meet those commercial goals, have that commercial lens. So I think that's a really lovely way to see it as well. It's not just you know, not hand holding, but huggy. You're actually there for a purpose, is to make money for some of these businesses. And so actually using manaakitanga and whanaungatanga are aspects of how we can do that. And I think I've mentioned this to you, but one thing I did struggle with stuff culturally, like if we've had colleagues whose had parents have died, no one does a collection, no one says flowers, no one does anything when they come back into the office. I found that incredibly counterintuitive, but also very unusual. I thought that was very unusual. And this person, they'll mention it and then they sit in their desk and then they go back into meetings and then do this. And so that is not necessarily the way that we or that I work. And so in those spaces, it was like, how do I provide manaaki to that person and they don't necessarily have asked for it, to ensure that they can settle back into this team, that they can contribute to this team, but they're safe in that team as well. So sometimes there is that real balance of being very open with how you operate, but actually in this culture, that doesn't really fit.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. When you were speaking, it made me think about like there are a lot more businesses and organizations now starting to measure their, I would say, like the outcomes based on like how happy their employees are. And
Mm.
there's a lot of research that shows that when their employees are happy, they perform. Like happiness equals performance. And so performance also typically equals profit. And if you speak to a lot of people, the thing that supports them to feel happy is feeling valued, right? And so it's just those natural, I was going to say skills, but it's like who we be as Māori and Pasifika people, where it's like manaakitanga, whanaungatanga, those things where it's care and respect, right? You thinking about like, how do I support this person in this way? This person's more willing to want to show up and then continue to do the work versus like I know people who have had workplaces show zero care and respect when someone close to them has passed away, like, in terms of bereavement leave and whatnot. And then they've just actually realized, well, this workplace like doesn't care about me. So why am I here? And then they leave and then they go and find a different workplace to then go and like work for because they actually know for themselves, right? Like for me, whānau family is important. And so it's like when you can know that as a leader and when you can also know that those things are not only important to you and your own leadership but also to the well-being of the collective. It's like, well, we almost have a responsibility to perhaps kind of start to push for these ways of being within these spaces, even though we might be coming up against like some red tape perhaps, or we might be coming up against these systems and structures. It's like, well, actually, how can we push for this and how can we actually utilize perhaps like evidence-based peer-reviewed articles that aren't necessarily culturally informed, but there is a lot of scientific research around happiness specifically.
Um, yeah, so I was actually thinking that it's, manaakitanga and whakawhanaungatanga remind us that leadership is that relational, which is what I think you were talking about at the start, and how important those relationships are for us in those spaces and what we do to make sure that we can sort of develop those. One thing I was thinking of when we were talking about leadership and one thing I'm quite curious about, and others on the call might be able to answer this, is we wear different hats. And actually, we may be leaders in our community, we may be leaders in our whānau. We're not necessarily leaders in our workspace or our work, in our jobs, because it might have that linear thing. How do you create those things so they merge together? Like, how can you be a leader in your community group and sort of apply that to where you are in your professional life?
I really love that question. Leadership is being as like essentially what's the word that I'm wanting to use? You're pushing for change. That's what leadership is about. So regardless of whether or not you have the title of being a CEO or senior leader, whatever role you are in, if you can see something that needs changing within the role that you're in, within the organization that you're in, that's leadership. And so it's about, okay, well, what am I doing to be able to better improve? Perhaps it's a system, right? So you might see that there is an opportunity to systemize something better. Or you might see that there is an opportunity for development within your team, perhaps. And even that might be like in a linear sense, like perhaps you notice, okay, well, actually, I don't have a skill and this skill's missing and it's preventing me from being able to excel in my role. Okay, well, what am I going to do about that? So how am I taking control, or how am I kind of being in my own self-leadership and personal responsibility to be
Yeah.
able to either develop that skill or perhaps go to the person who I report to and be like, hey, like I've noticed this, and what can we do to implement this across the board? And so leadership is the ability to be able to see that something needs to change and then to be able to essentially kind of push for that change.
Mm. Oh, any comments from the crowd before I move on? Catherine,
Ah, sorry.
you're already on.
Oh, am I?
Yeah, you're ready.
I'm trying to figure out this format on my phone, Aroha mai. I think it's been really lovely listening to you both, and I've managed to write a whole lot of sort of points and maybe that I need to remember. But just thinking about your sort of comments around, well, what does it feel like if you're not the boss, right? How does what
Yeah.
look and feel like? But I think there are some components of leadership that are slightly agnostic of your position, right? And you've been talking today about what I would call, although it's a bit jargony, that, you know, what it means to be authentic to yourself and in the workplace, right? And when you are authentic and to yourself, that manifests itself in a lot of ways, and one of those ways is consistency. You're consistent in the way you engage with people. You that people can be sure of the response they're going to get from you because of the way that you show up and bring yourself into that space, right? So you're creating safe spaces around you for people to engage with you, regardless of your position. And I think there are some other things in there about being really curious, being
Mm-hmm.
what I would call, in my mind, and for me, it's about being a bit nosy. What's going on over there and why are they doing that? And being able to do something which I think we're really good at because we're having to navigate across cross-cultural context, is be able to join dots that people can't necessarily see, and be able to go, oh, well, have you thought about X, Y, and Z? It doesn't actually, sometimes it doesn't even have to be with your boss. It could be with colleagues. So you're building a bit of a coalition of thinking in a different way, thinking of, just engaging. And I think the other thing for me about leadership, which has nothing to do with the position you're in, is being comfortable with being uncomfortable. So understanding sort of how you respond to discomfort. I'm lucky, I'm a senior manager, a senior leader, so I can, discomfort. I deliberately use discomfort in environments to create an environment where people have to think differently. But being able to understand how you respond in uncomfortable situations, coming back to your consistency, is a really powerful tool in your toolbox, right? Because it means that you're not going to kind of get knocked over if you get an outcome that you don't expect, or if people behave in a way you don't expect. You can kind of sit back and go, what was going on there? Because it's often not about you, it's about the other person. What was going on there, and how did I end up in this position? I might want to repeat it, but how might I want to avoid that in future? So these are nothing to do with your position in an organisation, right? And they are transferable across any environment you're in. If you're a Gunnock kapahaka and you love hanging out in that space, and you are leading in that space, all of those skills are transferable into a corporate environment, because they're about creating space for different ideas, they're about curiosity, they're about being consistent. So what you'll find, I'm sure you've all had bosses where you're not quite sure today whether it's a good day to engage with that person or not. They could, you're kind of getting signals that they're a bit off, or one day that they might respond one way to something and then the next day it's something else. But I think for me, a core part of being a great leader is actually being able to be consistent, or say to your people, to your team or your boss, I'm not having a great day today. And so, if you're lucky enough to be able to manage your own agenda, you can say, I think today's not a great day for me to have meetings. But it's also okay to say, today's not a great day for me. I might be a bit quieter than I would be normally. That doesn't mean I'm not listening and I'm not participating. We're doing the work, but I might just need a bit more time to kind of get along things. So those are just my observations. I'm loving this kōrero.
Kapai, thank you, Kath. Two things I thought of there were, I jotted down all those notes, Catherine. I will be making up a little review for everyone. But when that consistency you talked about, and being curious and being able to transfer those skills across, I think one thing I'm really want to know is, do people know that? Like, if you're a kapahaka gun and then you're going to your work, do you have the self-awareness to say, actually it is, or do you have to somehow get that self-awareness to say, actually, what I do in kapahaka is the same as people, and I've navigated 40 people, in matatini. I can do this. So it's actually having that awareness that you can pull those across, and they are applicable and they are consistent, and it doesn't really matter what environment you're in.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that sort of strikes me when we talk about whanaungatanga, and particularly women in the workplace, and I've had the privilege of being able to work alongside young women as they develop in their careers, especially young women who are mothers. And they will talk to me about struggling, about managing other people. And I said, what are you doing at home with your babies? Because you're doing exactly the same thing that you be applied in the workplace. You're creating conversations, you're being really clear about what you need to be done. So being able, and I think that's really part of whanaungatanga, is really understanding people's life outside of work and going, actually, you might, and this is the same with the kapahaka example. Oh, don't you do kapahaka? Aren't you already doing some of this over here? It's being able to have those conversations. I've got someone at work who leads scout groups, right? And he's wrangling all these kids, and he's really struggling at work in terms of wrangling people. I said, you're doing it all the time. What are you doing there that's working really well? And how might you bring it into this context? So it's about seeing that whole person, right?
I love that. And it made me even think about like being captain of like a netball team as an example, right? It's like, how are you utilizing that from like a sporting context and like drawing that into the different spaces that you're in.
Yeah.
Kapai. And I like curiosity, because I think that for me has been really the crux of doing these things and doing the next one and doing the panel discussion, is really curious about how people are doing these things over here, because we're away from home, we're away from our families, and we're away from our communities. How are we navigating these spaces? So thank you for that. I know we've got lots of time, guys. I wanted to really just touch on, and I think you were talking about it a bit, Catherine, was the emotional and cultural intelligence in leadership. So for me, who has been in the HR space, and I'm not an HR person, but in the HR space for 5+ years, I haven't really heard of these terms, Rawinia, and it's only been recently, and maybe it's because I'm in the education space where they talk about this stuff anyway, but they talk about it in the perspective of, you have to have it. You have to have emotional and cultural intelligence if you want to lead a team. And then I just was wondering, I think, have that anyway, but could you just sort of give an overview of what the CQ and EQ are?
Kath actually described it really essentially. So consistency, right, is so emotional intelligence, there's multiple different parts to it. So like one part's empathy, the ability to regulate your emotions. So if you can regulate your emotions, then you'll be consistent, right? And Kath was mentioning, oh, you know, that manager that you don't want to talk to because you can tell she's had a really bad day. Or if you were to talk to her, maybe she like might bite your head off like a dragon and like might yell at you. And so like that there is an example of not being able to regulate your emotions. And so it's understanding how are you taking care of yourself so that you're like not projecting onto your team and the people around you, or like Kath, you know, use the example actually, hey, like I'm not having a great day, so you know, this is how I'm going to be. If you need anything, you know, maybe go and see X, Y, and Z, or come back to me tomorrow, whatever it might be. So that's also like part of it. It's the ability to be self-aware, which again kind of comes back to that authenticity piece. It's like, okay, can I actually reflect and see perhaps, okay, I like, you know, I didn't get the outcome that I was hoping to get out of this situation. So what do I need to do differently next time and not take it personally and look at it, okay, actually, this is just a skill that I need to develop. And maybe I need to develop having a confronting conversation, perhaps, which is a skill that I see a lot, especially with a lot of women. Perhaps they're not that great at it. They avoid having tough, hard conversations sometimes. And so it's that ability to be able to reflect and see, okay, well, actually what happened there? Emotional intelligence, what else is there?
I was interested in, I think we talked about it, which is that self-regulation.
Yes, it is definitely the self-regulation part. Like I'm gonna use an example. So I used to like actually be really bad at this, and I used to take things really personally, and I would like break down crying sometimes at work when someone would give me feedback, because I would take like feedback as like you are wrong as a person versus it being like actually, you know, like there's just a skill that's like missing. But that also sometimes comes down to also like how the feedback is delivered as well. And some people in leadership positions don't know how to do that either. And so there's like so many nuances to it. But if you can like emotional regulation, like as a tool, like if you were to take this away, actually, I'll give this all to you because it's really powerful and it's really simple, is actually using the breath. And so like you know, our ha to be able to change our state. And so you can automatically change your state by regulating your breathing, and all you need to do is breathe in through your nose for a count of 2 and then out through your mouth for a count of 6. And if you do that for about 2 minutes, what you're going to do is you're going to come out of fight and flight. You're going to come into your parasympathetic nervous system, which is your place of like rest and digest, so that you can be able to think critically. Because if you have gotten really upset by some feedback that someone's given you and you're off flying, like your temper's gone like a million miles an hour, you're not going to be able to think critically. You're not going to be able to make any kind of great decisions. It's just not going to be helpful. So your ability to perhaps be like, hey, actually, you know, I need to go and take 5 minutes. I'm going to go step outside, breathe, come back to your center, right? And then to be able to start to look at things critically. That's what I mean by like emotional regulation, and your ability to be able to essentially like handle yourself within these different spaces. And you know, there's nothing wrong with perhaps, you know, if you do take things personally again, but it's just having that self-awareness to know, oh, okay, something's happening here. I perhaps maybe want to, you know, either attack or withdraw. And so what can I do to support myself so that I'm perhaps not behaving in that way?
There's some really good tools out there, and then Rawinia's just outlined a couple. One of the ones I use quite a lot is, you know, I used to be exactly the same, Rawinia. I'd take it all like that. And one of the tools I learned was, it's almost, you get the feedback and it's this big, and then you layer on top of it, what have I made this mean, right? And so it becomes bigger, and then you go, oh well, what does this mean for how people see me? And then this thing becomes this huge issue in your head, right? And sometimes being able to just do some technical exercise which goes, actually, what's the actual data of this situation? Have I been told? Not what have I made it mean, which is a different thing, right? What have I been told? And then how do I use that data to inform my next steps? Because sometimes the way we interpret things, we put it through a whole lot of filters that may or may not be working particularly well that day. So being able to go, what's the actual data of this situation, and then how's it making me feel? Why is it making me feel like that? Actually, what is the thing that's making me feel like that? Is it because I feel really exposed, or because I'm really embarrassed because people might think I haven't done the job right, or I don't know what I'm doing, or actually I really don't like that person. They really get up my nose, and I really don't like having feedback. So there's a whole lot of things that we build onto this little, it's not, and often it's not little, but sometimes, and the breathing I think is amazing. Going for a walk is amazing. I like to listen to ocean waves. But there's a whole lot of things. But I think the real key part that you both are talking about is really being very self-reflective, and sometimes that's hard to do at the beginning, because you actually don't know much about yourself if you're not doing this regularly. And sometimes it's really helpful to ask a trusted friend or colleague, actually, what did you think about me doing that in that room? Or I've had the delights recently of doing 360 reviews, which I was horrified, but you're getting this broad range of people, and frankly what happens is they kind of confirm the things that you already know yourself, that you kind of know that you kind of have to work on, and you thought you were hiding it really well, but but if you pick the right people, they'll tell you, maybe she needs to just work on X, Y, and Z. So people but they have to be trusted people. They have to be kind, and they have to be curious as well.
I love that. Asking for feedback is one of the most potent tools for self-leadership and development that you can do, and it's like within your own control. And I love how you said, people who you trust, someone who is kind, but also someone who has your best interests at heart. You also want someone to be honest with you as well, and not necessarily enable bad behavior or tolerate poor behavior as well. And that curiosity piece as well. I think I want to go back to that, Claire, just really quickly. It's like, when you can be curious about why people are behaving the way that they're behaving, or like ask, like, what's your experience within this? Like, can you tell me a bit more? Like, I want to understand what's going on for you. Like, then sometimes the answer might not be what it is that you think that it is. Like what Kath was saying, like you might have made it mean something else completely, because you're looking at it through your lens, your perspective, like your background, where you grew up, your culture. But then for this other person who perhaps is from the other side of the world, who grew up with a completely different family dynamic, went to a different type of schooling, they see it really differently. And so when you can seek to understand and be curious about how they see things, then that informs, not only the outcome within the conversation or within the team, but then also it layers on so much more in terms of your own wisdom and knowledge around, okay, how do I then show up again in the future when it comes to this person, or perhaps like, people from, this cultural setting as an example. So that curiosity piece is like, that's kind of where that cultural intelligence kind of comes in.
Yeah. And I just I love that. And sorry, I'm yapping away. I've got a Muslim colleague, and they had a mate in their whānau, right? And we had a meeting the next day, and we have lots of conversations about coming from different cultures. And I said, oh, well, how does it work? How does the sort of tangi process work? And he was explaining to me. I said, oh, that's really similar to what we do. Everyone gathers and lots of kai and all those sorts of things. And it was a really, really lovely way of sort of creating connections and similarities just by asking a few questions. And the same thing I often do, talk to them around Ramadan and sort of how or Eid or all the celebrations that they have that I have no idea about. Say, oh, how does this work? What does this, and actually you're building those connections across cultures, and then you're strengthening all that scaffolding of a relationship, aren't you? Plus, I'm just nosy. How does this work? What do you do?
And I think that's the benefit we have of living in these global spaces, is we have access and exposure to so many other different cultures, and I know, and that's how we connect, right, through that cultural piece and trying to understand each other and having. I definitely think you have a bit more. Broader understanding of if something happens, like I really randomly, there's a Ghanaian woman in my team, because Black women wear wigs, and the amount of people that talk about her hair to her, it just blows my mind. And I'm thinking they have no cultural understanding that that's maybe not tika, that's not the right thing to do. And I knew enough to know that didn't feel right. And I was just like, people seem really obsessed with your hair. She's just like, yeah, that's what they do. Because she'll change it, be straight and then it'll be curly. And I think that was how people were trying to relate to. But I just found that really interesting and really lucky that we get to have those kind to and I think that really broadens it. I lost my train of thought of where we were going with that. We were talking about emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence. Does anyone else have any experience or questions about that before Catherine, Rawinia and myself?
Sorry, guys.
It's all right. This is what it's about.
I love it, Catherine. You've added so much value into this space, so thank you.
So I think we're talking about self-awareness, self-regulation, and what skills they were to be able to, operate in these spaces. So how's cultural awareness different? Or is that intelligence different? Or is that what I was just talking about, having the ability to recognise other cultures that are different to your own?
Yeah, it's that willingness to be open to understanding different ways of being through that cultural lens, right? Knowing that we don't all operate the same way. And so it's being curious instead of making assumptions based on your own lived perspective, because, again, like what's right, Tika, what's right to you can be offensive to someone else from another culture. And so it's understanding, okay, well, if this is right to me and this is offensive to this person, then actually, how do we navigate this? Like, how do we actually navigate it? And, I don't really like generalizing, but, you look at like some cultures are a lot more, like really more like forward and there's that, okay, like go after what it is that you want. And then some it's like, actually, that's really disrespectful. And so like showing respect also means like not speaking up. And so like this is something that I also like learned working in the gym of all places. And so a lot of Pasifika cultures, like it's actually disrespectful to speak up and say anything. And so if you're aware of that and you're asking your team, oh, like, what do you think? And then you've got Pasifika people and they're saying nothing. Well, how do you navigate that? How do you create a safe space for them to be able to voice and use their opinion when they see that as disrespectful? And so it's like, actually, how can you support them to know that, well, your voice is important in this situation and it's not being disrespectful, and being able to understand all of those differences. And that there is like how you really create a safe space for your team, all the people that you're leading, and just being able to understand all of those things. Similarly to within like the Chinese culture, like, again, it's like, no, eyes down. And people think, for a lot of us, that like it's respectful to look people in the eyes, but other cultures, it's like, no, you don't look at someone in the eye, that's disrespectful. And so being able to be curious around what is considered respectful in different cultures, different contexts, really supports you to be a better leader and to be able to better facilitate certain spaces so that people feel safe to show up as themselves authentically.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's one thing I quite enjoy about the changes I do in my role. My clients are very different, but they're global, so I get access and are able to have conversations with very different people culturally, and then that opens up a really good way to talk about being Māori and how do we do things, and what does this mean and what does that mean, and so that's why I really enjoy it, and then I would like to see sort of Voices and Voyages start to sort of expand into really to start looking at all Indigenous cultures and how it is that we relate to each other. But that's my dream. I'm also mindful we've got 10 minutes left of a 45-minute conversation. I said started at 7. So we'll start looking at wrapping things up. Please interject if you have any other questions or thoughts. But I just wanted to ask Rawinia, one of my questions was around for many of us, leadership might not feel like something formal. What should we think about when we're identifying where we lead, whether it's in our whānau, in our workplace or community? And I think Catherine touched on this, is like, how do we get that self-awareness when I ask someone about leadership, that they can say, actually, I do it in my whānau, and I do it in my community group. This is what I can kind of do, and start looking at testing in that professional one, so I can start doing the leadership roles in that space.
Mm-hmm. I actually think leadership is a choice. So first off, it's like you actually have to decide that you are a leader and that you want to be a leader. And then from there, the self-awareness is like understanding, okay, perhaps like, what do I see in the people around me? What are the qualities? What are the characteristics of people who I admire within their leadership? And where perhaps are the gaps? Like, this is from a self-awareness perspective, that those skills that perhaps I don't have, but also what do I do well as well? And so I also want to really acknowledge that, because, if you are feeling called to leadership, my belief is that you are a leader. No matter what your role or what your title is like, you're on this call for a reason, you're listening to this replay for a reason, is because leadership is in your blood or it's in your calling. And so when you make that decision, then it's about, okay, how am I building my skill set? And that comes from being able to ask better questions and being able to ask better questions about, well, who am I? Who am I being? What are my actions and behaviors? What does that look like? And that comes through that self-reflection piece. And in a conversation I know that we had, like, it comes down to, okay, well, a simple tool that you can use is like journaling at the end of the week. Okay, well, what did I do well? What perhaps didn't I do well? Like, what mistakes did I make, and what could I have done differently if I was to do it differently? And, kind of from there, what am I committing to next week now that I know this new thing about me? And then again, further from that, who can I get to support me? Because I think that's also another thing, is sometimes we try and do it all on our own versus can we seek out mentorship within our organization? Like, is there someone within your organization who, maybe it might not be someone who you report to directly, it might be someone else actually who you're like, actually, I really love this person's way of leading, and can I perhaps ask them to have a coffee, and can I learn some things from this person, and seeking out mentorship in that way. Or it might be seeking out mentorship and coaching externally, perhaps if you don't have any examples within your organization, because I know that, there aren't always, like, there are some incredible leaders in many spaces, but perhaps you might not have that. And so that there, I've completely forgot the answer, but this is like, I mean, a question. This is like, but that there is some of the key kind of steps, is like, one, choosing it, and then looking at it from a really growth mindset perspective, which is like that curiosity and that continuous like curiosity. And then further from that, how can it not be about me? And it actually be about service and about the people around you, your community, that there, when we can start to remove ourselves, like, yes, like the reflection of self, but when you don't make it about you, it's so much easier. It's like, okay, when I make it about my people, okay, well, what do my people need? Okay, great. Okay, well, I don't have this skill. I'm like really awful at it. And so maybe I need to develop that. Or actually, is there someone else who's better suited to it? And so it allows you to, if we kind of circle it back to that whole emotional intelligence piece, it's like, okay, well, knowing that this is what is needed within my team, my community, my space, and actually, you know what? It's not about me. So then I'm not going to take it personally.
Yeah. And I definitely think, the more self-awareness, the more experience you have, you just don't take those things personally, right? Sometimes it's just not about you, to be honest. But I liked your thread from that leadership to self-awareness. And I think the word we were discussing the other day was intentional. Be intentional about it as well. And using tools like mentoring and coaching to help you develop. But that one piece around removing ourselves is, I think, quite an important one as well, which we really hadn't touched on. I didn't really have anything else in that scope around those two. And I think we were going to talk about how we applied in our leadership, but I think we've discussed that already. And I'm mindful it's nearly 8:00. Does anyone else have any sort of final thoughts, any shared experiences that they want? Otherwise, I will close us up.
Or any questions, actually.
Yeah, any questions. And you'll be able to ask questions after this if you've had any sort of further thought. I'm on the socials, Rawinia's on the socials, DM us. If you think that there could be a part 2 of this around, I don't know, mentoring or coaching or leadership part 2, we might get Catherine to lead it. I think you've got some great whakaaro there, Catherine, and added those words I think Rawinia and I talked about, curiosity. It's not about you. And being agnostic in your position and your leadership, I think are really good little things that require a bit of further exploring. But anyone got any sort of final words before I close us off with a karakia?
Just want to say thanks so much for the kōrero. This has been really insightful. I don't like leadership, so I tell myself, but then I had to manage at one stage and I kind of got thrust into it, and I had to manage people, and I don't think I'm the best people manager, so now I've become a specialist just in what I do, but actually I think maybe I could lead in terms of collaboration and brainstorming. I'm quite good at that with other people, so it's just knowing what categorizing and knowing what kind of people leadership there can be. So this has been really useful. You've helped me just to think about that. So thank you.
And you have our contacts in if you need to reach out and talk about it a little bit more.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
happy to jump on a call, have a cup of tea. Kapai. Anyone else? Maku te karakia whakamutunga. Aroha my mum.
I'd just like to say thank you for letting me eavesdrop on your conversation. And it's just reminded me that when we go into our workspaces, that we actually do take ourselves in there 100%. We can't divide ourselves and have a work me and a Māori me. They're one and the same thing. And we just draw on our values. I think they really do underpin the way that we think and operate within the workspace. And as well as sort of thinking about ourselves within that workspace, when you are leading people, it's about creating safe spaces for them. If you think about the leaders that you've worked with and worked for, you know the ones that you would go back to, and you know the ones that you wouldn't. And unfortunately, for some of us, our learning has been based on bad experiences. So, but they're all good experiences at the end because they inform how we think and how we do our mahi and how we are as people. So thank you.
Kia ora, thank you for that, Mum. I do think for me that has been the key takeaway, and I think Catherine mentioned it earlier, is about being your whole self as well, and how we can just. I also think, in part of our broader community here in the UK, is like how we can encourage others to do that as well. Is how do we get others to do that leadership and have that recognition and know that if they are doing the kapahaka and they are leading, that actually they are doing it anyway. So why don't you just do it over there at work? So for me, that is a really key takeaway and something that I'm going to work at sort of recognising in my own group as well. And ngā mihi kia koe, Jacinta, for your comments as well. It's really great to meet you, and I hope we see you around in other spaces as well. This won't be the last time that Voices and Voyages will hold something. Nō reira, ngā mihi mai aha kia koutou I tae mai I tēnei hui, I tēnei pō, he hui whai tikanga, he hui whai hua. Ka mihi anō au kia koe, Rawinia, mō tō whakaaro, mō tō kaha kia tātou. Nō reira, ka tira, tēnā tātou katoa.